risk adjustment and how much I enjoy that. But you know, just networking in general, we want to make sure that you're comfortable doing that. And eventually you'll become a subject matter expert. If you're new, you may already be a subject matter expert. And then we're also tonight going to kind of look around Encoder and Encoder. You know, we at CCO like to use Find a Code, and it's not because their colors are purple and green like ours. Although I like to say that, and Laureen does too, that they had us at purple and green, right? So we're going to kind of look around there and give you a few little pointers and tips and how to navigate an encoder. For the most part, they're all about the same. But there's some features that don't just come standard that maybe you would like to know more about or see. And we'll do that. Now, normally we have, of course, we're live streaming on Facebook and YouTube. I do have YouTube up, but I don't have Facebook up because I'm running a lot of things behind the scenes. And Boyd is actually at the airport in Vegas and then live streaming out of Flint, Michigan. So again, it's amazing what happens behind the scenes. While we're waiting for Liz to come, I think I'm going to go ahead and let's talk about getting through an encoder. Let's start with that. Now, again, I can look every few minutes. I'll look over here and see if I can find any questions coming up or any, you know, if you want to say anything, feel free to do so. But I don't have my eyes on those like I normally would. Laureen was feeling a little under the weather, so she was not going to be with us tonight. And she may poke her little eyeballs in and check on us later. So let's start with an encoder. I'm going to just bring mine over so you can kind of see what it looks like. You know what? Again, whatever encoder you are used to using, probably one's provided for you if you work someplace. It's very common to have one provided, or maybe you work independent, you're an independent contractor and you're looking for an encoder. Again, we love Find a Code. So there's some features on Find a Code that is standard, you know, with all encoders. The first thing I would say is, you know, you can just type in a code. Now these, you can see the codes that I've been looking at recently because it shows them. So let's just go look at one real quick. Here is one for COPD, I think. J441 is emphysema. Yeah, acute exacerbation. The encoders, that when you look at those, one of the things that you'll notice that they all have their information on the page a little bit differently, but this is pretty standard. So again, you get your code and your code description. You've got your excludes, and notice the excludes 2, excludes 1 here. You're going to get you're always going to get the ICD-9 code because there's still some people that are using ICD-9, or maybe they're doing some retrospective audits way back, right? And 491.21 is the, and I can flip back and forth. I can click on that. But again, includes, right? All prior or after the code. Now, let's look down here at some of these neat features. One of the things that I use a lot, especially if you're a risk adjustment coder, that a different additional information. There you go. There's all of my risk adjustment information. Not only do they give me all of the previous risk adjustment versions, but I got the RX, HCC, and the HHS, which is a lot of them don't give you HHS, and everything risk adjusts now. So notice that, you know, it's a 160 instead of a 111. It is a different code. If there's any specific guidelines or anything, they'll highlight them here. I don't find myself looking there very often, but what I do like is coming down here and making myself some notes. When I went to one of the regional conferences last year, you know, my focus last year was interventional radiology. I tried to increase my knowledge base as much as I could in interventional radiology. And then this year I'm working really hard with oncology to increase my knowledge. So I try to pick something every year. And when I was sitting in a lecture, I had my iPad up and I just brought up Find a Code. And when they were talking about specific codes, I would bring up the code and then I would write myself little notes in there that they told that they were saying. And, you know, that was fabulous. That was so easy to do. I really appreciated being able to do that. Let me tell you. So now whenever I go and look at a code, I can see if I have a note in there for that code. Another thing is articles and newsletters. With, you know, if you pay for a little bit more, you can get Coding Clinic. So now I know with J11.1, look, I got all of these coding clinics that address it with the title, and then I can click on that and bring up that exact one. And then this is something that gets talked about a lot: emphysema and acute exacerbation. So let's bring that up in another. I think this is something I can get rid of. We'll bring that up. You know, fascinating, because it gives me the article or the question and then the answer, right? And then it gives me this reference. So if I want to do some teaching and somebody asks me about this code, you know, is this the proper code to use for that? And they give the answer, I can reference right there. I just copy and paste the Coding Clinic as an educational tool. Absolutely love it. Now let's look over here. Let's close this out. See how I can just collapse those? Decision Health, it tells me how many articles are there. So let's close out of that. Now, articles and newsletters is additional features that you pay for. Coding tips, sometimes they have a really good coding tip, but they're not always based on what you're looking for. So this is one that gets talked about a lot, you know, exacerbation, COPD, and asthma. There was some gray area last year that was discussed a lot, and how do we code that? You know, some people wanted to code, gosh, I can't remember off the top of my head. It was like J 44.9 and 0.1, and I think 0.3 or something. I can't remember all of the discussions off the top of my head, but anyway, I know you know what I'm talking about. Then these other features, like if I want to go in and look at the DRG grouper, right? I got an MDC and a DRG, and I got complication and comorbidity information that I can access. Of course, I can map. Most all of them have the maps in drug dictionary, Medicare policies and guidelines, commercial payers, MIPS. You know, isn't that great? So if you, and there's even other features that they have in here that I am not paying for. Now let's go look at, let's say I want to go and look at the guidelines for ICD-10. Okay, so I can go over here to the codes. I can pick what year I want to see the guidelines in. So if I say ICD-10 guidelines, I can click on this, and there's 2019, and it will just literally bring up a copy that I can pull off of a PDF if I want to have it. And I know, because I was looking at these yesterday, it's 120 pages if I wanted to look at that. But look, it goes all the way back to 2011. How advantageous is this to be able to have access to those if you're an auditor? You have to go back and look at information for a previous year. Really handy, isn't it? But that's not all. So I've got all these code sets that you can, and all this information. I can run through a super bill. I can look at forms and checklists if I want, and again, lots of information. Most encoders have these. You, again, will have different levels that you pay for. So if you don't use something, then, you know, you don't want to pay for that, right? Let's go to tools. Let's say I want to look up a code. One of the things that I like for educational purposes, and this is going to work with all encoders, is how to look up a code as if you're looking it up in the index. Now, if you're a student, you're not going to look it up like this, right? You're going to have your manual. Hold on just a second. Let me see. I know Liz is in. Liz, I know you're muted. So if you want to unmute yourself anytime, go ahead. And then let's say I want to look up a myocardial infarction. So again, just like you look up in your index, infarction. So right there, I can so multitask. Okay, so it's telling me, oh, no results, but look at all these lists. Here we go. Complications following a myocardial infarction. I can hear Liz now. Look at all these that I can pick one. So let's see. I think I do want a complication of an acute myocardial infarction, just like you're looking it up in the index. And so then it tells me, hey, you had to go look up under complication, and then you're going to be able to come down and drop down these. Now, again, let's say, okay, say, let me just show you here, artificial. It says, oh, fertilization or insemination gives you the code, heart, and then opening. See how it just, encoders are so handy, and then you can just keep opening up. Not all of them navigate exactly the same way, but for the most, they navigate like this. So if we deal with an opening, and that's how our brain thinks, it's saying, okay, by the way, that's, I understand what you want. Which one of these openings are you going to look under? And so, oh, okay, well, I decided now I don't want to look up, let's not do a myocardial infarction. I just like saying that. Let's just look up a colostomy. So that tells me I just have to go down here, right? Oh, colostomy, stoma. Just open up that, and it gives me this range. Okay, so this is unspecified, but if I need to go, how about we have an infection in a colostomy as a complication? See, isn't that awesome? All right, then I can just go jump out here to that code if I want, and it starts over just like what I told you with the J44.1 code. Super handy. Now, if you're a student, you're not going to be using an encoder, quite honestly, because you can't take those in to test with you. And so I advise you not to spend a lot of time with the encoders until, you know, you're certified. That's just my advice. You still can go in there and play around and look at them, but don't use them to do your studying. Because you'll always fall back on those manuals, and you need to train yourself and get familiar and almost have like that muscle memory of working and through your manuals and finding your codes that way, right? That's pretty important to do that. Anything that can shave time off when you're getting ready to test. It doesn't matter what credential you're setting for, whether you're being proctored through the AAPC or maybe you're doing a HEMA and you're going to work at a testing center. It doesn't matter. You're not going to be able to have an encoder with you. Let me just get rid of this because I don't need that up there now that we've got that. Okay, this is very helpful. Again, though, in real life coding, because I can look at a code and then I have access to all of that information above and beyond what I may need to make the best decision or get to the highest specificity for what I'm looking for. And it doesn't matter what type of coding that you're doing. If you're doing auditing, if you're doing CDI work and you need to look at the verbiage, all of the verbiage for one code to make sure that, you know, the documentation is there. Because if we are auditing or we're doing CDI work and we're educating, we're that liaison, remember, for the provider. It's really important that they are helping us because they, quite honestly, they don't want to mess with the coding. That's not what they went to med school for, but they understand this is what I have to do to get reimbursed. So as the coder, you're the translator for them. So with their documentation, we're going to translate it into a format or a code set so that we can collect statistics and we can also get reimbursed. But we have to ultimately be speaking the same language. And I gave an example the other day when I was doing an auditing lecture that, you know, we do predominantly speak the same language. We both had AMP. We've, you know, a lot of coders are very, very savvy in the disease process and even understanding how procedures done or verbiage are being done. However, it's almost like though we're both speaking English, but one of us is speaking English from Britain and the other one is speaking English from America, right? We speak the same language, we understand each other, but there's still a few words that don't translate, you know? So if we are talking about a boot, I'm from Texas, it's a cowboy boot, right? But they're talking about the trunk of their car, right? And a lift is an elevator. And, you know, a torch is something you stick out in the backyard to get rid of the bugs. And they are using that as a flashlight. I like their jumper is a sweater, their jumper. And our jumper is like a dress. Anyway, that's funny, I know. All right, so Liz is with us. I want to go ahead and start talking to her. If you have any questions about using an encoder, you're more than welcome to get our opinion on encoders. But again, I'll tell you right up front, the one you learn to use on is usually the one you stick with. It doesn't matter that some I know some people that have access to more than one encoder. The one they like to use and the one that their employer provides. But it really depends what you're working in. And I like Find a Code because they're real education based, and it's easy for me as an educator to use them for references and stuff like that. So when I want to grab something, some CDI or auditing or anything, I can access it there. Maybe it's the coding clinic that I want to show the provider. And then the provider says, hey, but this is the way I document this procedure because these are all the things that I do. It's like, oh, okay. So that makes sense because that translates as this, right? And they say, yes, you know, things like that. It just works real well. Okay, so let me get out of this and let's just get back over here now to Liz's information. Liz, do you want me to call you Liz or Elizabeth?
Liz is fine. It usually works out better than trying to get Elizabeth out.
Yeah. Did you have any trouble with your camera? Do you want to put your camera up or do you want to just talk?
I'll just talk today. I didn't realize we were going to be on the camera, so I'm not quite.
That's all right. I can hear you just fine. Okay, so Liz is going to let me kind of interview her, but let me tell you how I know Liz. We were together in New Braunfels, which is an area of Texas, and they were having it wasn't really a conference, it was more like a seminar, I guess it would be, where they had brought in some subject matter experts, some SMEs, and they were doing lectures. And I have the topics because I have my CEUs. We had virtual world coding, we had urology, we had correctional institutional management. That was really exciting, and medical ethics. And Liz talked about virtual world coding, right, Liz? Isn't that what your topic was?
Yeah, coding in a virtual world, I think.
You know, and she was really, really good. There's one thing about going and getting to go to these different things is you get to network. It's really, really important. Now, Liz is the website. Let me just pull the website over real quick for you. And then I'll jump around just a little bit, Liz. But this is where she works. And one of the things that I really liked when I looked at your website was this price list. And I'm going to show them that in just a minute. But first, now that everybody's got a view of this, we'll come back to that. I want to go back. Can you explain, everybody pretty much knows what CPC is, but real quickly, some people may not know what a CDEO is and what a CEDC is. Can you let them know what those credentials are and what they're
Absolutely.
for?
Yeah, so all 3 credentials are through the AAPC. CDEO is Certified Documentation Expert Outpatient. It's a mouthful. Basically, it is the documentation criteria that's needed to support the E&M levels and the procedures performed in the outpatient setting. So we're talking EDs, physicians' offices, things like that. CEDC is a Certified Emergency Department Coder, which is kind of self-explanatory. Emergency department is what I have most of my experience in. I've been doing it for a long, long time. Probably about 15 years ago. So I've seen it go from, very small amount of charts and some very bad dictation and some very bad, carbon copies to what it is today with the EMR. So emergency, it's varied and it's very interesting, especially.
I absolutely love emergency medicine because I, before I was even, well, I guess I was out of high school. I just graduated, and that summer I signed up for an EMT course, and I wasn't able to, I was going to miss the written exam. You take a clinical exam and then you take a written exam, but you had to be 18 to take the written exam. And my birthday fell the week before the written exam. And so I wasn't going to be 18, but I did get to take the clinical, where they have you, put in tubes and put people on backboards and flip them over and make sure that you know how to, do all that kind of stuff. But so my original goal way back then was to be a flight nurse in emergency medicine. That's what I had planned to do. Didn't work out that way, but that's okay. Now I just don't get thrown up on, right? I can still do emergency medicine and don't get thrown up.
You are off of the bloody side, is what I said.
That's right. The smells, none of that stuff I have to deal with. So I was telling them earlier that you would be classified as a subject matter expert in emergency medicine, or ED. I always call it, because we always call it ER back in the day, and now most people say ED department. Let me go back to your website real quick. And I'm not going to ask you how long you've been doing this and all this, because, I think you're my age. We don't want to say, it's been a long time. We've been doing this a long time, probably.
Yeah, we've been doing this for a while.
Well, when she gave her lecture at New Braunfels, it was really fun, because she was talking about the things that you need that a lot of people don't think about when working remote, and so I've been working remote for a long time. As you know, everybody at CCO is remote, but she even said a few things like, oh, that's right, I wouldn't have thought of that. I was like, oh yeah. It was really, really quite a good lecture. So this is their founder, but I just wanted to here's Liz, so now you can put a pretty face to her voice. And now that I've shown them that, this is what I really enjoyed, because you don't see this on most. It says, we're not afraid to show our prices. If any of you now have thought about getting into auditing, and you got to have time under your belt, you can go get the credential, that's okay, but nobody's going to hire you to audit independently. You may work for somebody, and Liz can give us a little insight on what their company would look for if they were to hire somebody as an auditor or just to work in emergency medicine, doing the coding and everything. But I really appreciated that this was all put in here, and it was just flat out like, okay, this is what we charge, and this is predominantly what you're going to see in most places. But know though that this isn't just one person going out and doing the work. It's a company that goes out and does the work. They still have overhead and stuff like that. But take some time to look at her website and get a feel for, you know, all the things that are involved in working in auditing, if that's something that's going to interest you. And quite honestly, you can get the credential, but you're going to have to start on the ground floor, right? As they always say.
Absolutely. There's quite a bit that goes into being a CPMA if you do get that credential in auditing. You do have to have, unfortunately, a little bit of billing under your belt, because when you start working on audits from different facilities, there's things you need to really look at. You know, are they access? Are they critical access hospital? Are they a trauma hospital? You know, what type of physicians are the physicians theirs, or are they from an outside group? So, I mean, there's a lot of different things that's going to come into play with your modifiers and with whether you're billing globally and those types of things. So that only comes from experience. It only comes from it and doing it. And because most of the time, the people that are giving you the audit don't really even know that. You pick it up from the billing statements and things like that that you get during the audit. So yeah, it takes some time.
That is really a good point, because I was just we just finished this week our new lectures for the auditing course that we offer, and a lot of that was in there. That, you know, an auditor wears more than one hat. They aren't just looking at the coding, right? And you have to know ICD, you have to know CPT, and you probably have to know PCS too, don't you? I mean, isn't that going to be, or in emergency medicine, does that cross over at all? Do you have to
no, emergency medicine is not going to cross over. The PCS is going to be mostly when you're doing inpatient surgeries, not outpatient.
Okay. And
which I'm happy about most of the time.
I like PCS. So you've got more than one code set that you have to know all the guidelines to, right? Now, another thing that isn't mentioned is that Liz is in Texas, but what if somebody asked her to go over to Louisiana? So then she has to find out what all the state guidelines are and regulations for coding ER over there for the different payers.
You're dealing with you're dealing with different Medicaids, and you're dealing with a different CMS. Not overlord. But
I know what you mean. That's an inside joke.
And they have all pretty much gotten stabilized over the past few years, but there for a while they had radically different ideas about what documentation was acceptable for the ED record. So the same ED record in California was not coded the same way as it was in Florida because of the CMS entity that was.
Right. Yeah, see, that's a good point. And then, okay, so then you have to know, like she said, the CDI work, the documentation, right? And when you're auditing, doing external audits like that, you're not auditing for providers that you know, right? So when you're internal and you're doing auditing, and you should definitely do internal audits a lot, but you're coming in with a fresh set of eyes that I like to say, you know that Febreze commercial where people go nose blind? You know, when you're in a practice and you're doing this stuff again and again and again, yeah, you kind of know things are happening out there. What's OIG looking at? You know, we read the articles and stuff, but you almost need to have somebody to come in and look at that with a fresh set of not nose blind eyes, so they can say, hey, do you realize that this is happening, or that you're doing this, or that this documentation, you know, or the reimbursement, and so you have to know CDI, you have to know reimbursement, you have to know the code sets, you have to know the modifiers, you have to know what else? What are some other things that the besides like the different states? What else would be something that?
Well, I know, for instance, I lived in Kentucky. I'm actually from Kentucky. One of the things that happens in those hospitals a lot are they are the only ones in their area, so they're critical access hospital. That's difficult to say for some reason. So what happens with those is they get incentives, certain ways that when you're coding for those, especially on the facility side, that you need to trigger that, but with the modifier, you need to trigger that with a revenue code. And if you don't know that they are a critical access hospital, then you're going to miss out on that because it's not going to be put on the, it's because they're not going to tell you that you're missing it. You need to make sure that you're telling the person that you're doing the external audit for, hey, you are labeled as a critical access hospital. You could be getting this revenue if you're doing it this way. So that's one of the other major ways that you need to look.
That's another thing I like to bring up. You know, we're that liaison, and we code for statistical purposes. That's the purpose for the code sets and what we do. However, it's a convenient way to get paid. So that's what everybody talks about, right? But you know, there's a fine line between what your provider has all this knowledge in their head and everything, and sometimes they have difficulty getting it onto paper, you know, as we say, and we have to be there as the coders or even the auditors to come back and say, now listen, I know that this procedure is done this way, right? But I'm suspecting that you're losing reimbursement because I'm not seeing the documentation that allows the coder to pick this up. You know, and all we have to do is, like, we're not telling them what to document, but we're saying, you know, if you do this procedure, if you do A procedure versus B procedure, what's the difference? And they say, okay, well, it's step XYZ. I always do XYZ with A procedure. Oh, okay. But you see, that's not in the documentation. So the coder can't tell if it's A or B, right?
Well, yeah, one of the major things that, you know, we tell doctors, educating them, is that if you haven't written it down, it didn't happen.
Right.
Out there, it doesn't occur. And it comes into play with what you were talking about. It's a clinical way of looking at things opposed to a coder way of looking at things. So the clinician looking at it, and the words that they use don't necessarily translate correctly when you're looking it up in the book. An example of that is non-contributory. Non-contributory is not a good thing to put on your past family social history in the ED. Auditors don't like that. The government auditors really don't like that. But to a doctor, non-contributory just simply means that they had nothing to say that was going to help the chart or was going to be go back to the HPI. It didn't have anything to do with the visit today. Another one is no acute distress. Well, if you're level 5 paid or critical care and somewhere on the document there is a no acute distress, in the clinician's mind, there was no acute distress at the time that they examined them. That doesn't mean that they were not still in danger of becoming critical, which is what an E&M level is actually evaluating. So there's things like that that don't translate clinically to the coder world.
Right. And that's that is the reason that providers have coders, to translate and be that liaison, right? And so they educate the coder, and then the coder educates them in turn, so that the provider can be reimbursed at the, you know, for the work that they're actually doing. You know, we want to say our statistics at the highest level possible, right? We always want to code to the highest specificity, but we don't always speak the same language. Now, about working in ER, what do you find, just to pick your brain to see if there's anybody out there is thinking, you know what, I've always kind of wondered about that, but what is there something that drew you to that particular area, or what you think if somebody really likes something that they may be wanting to specialize in that? Is there some kind of insight you could provide, or not?
One of the major reasons that I really enjoy doing ED work is because it is fast-paced. I know a lot of times when you're doing, especially inpatient, you're looking at a 90 to 100-page document. You do 4 a day, and you know, it can really be tedious if you're not that type of person that has the patience to do that. I can, when I was coding, I don't actually do production coding anymore, but I could do, you know, 20 to 25 charts an hour. So you get to done a day. You've looked at a lot of charts, and you feel like for me, it was more of a sense of accomplishment. And I'm the type of person that likes to sit and read every line. You know, I do enjoy the faster pace of an ED. The other reason that I enjoy ED is that you don't just have the same codes over and over and over and over and over. You know, I had to use obstetric diagnosis. I've had to use pediatric diagnosis. I've had to code anything from a fracture to an IND to a laceration, nosebleeds. There's lots of different things that come into play. So I just feel like it's a wider variety of codes that you get to use, and I find that a lot more interesting than doing it over and over and over.
I have to tell you, that's exactly why, another reason why I liked working in emergency medicine, because it was never boring, and the documentation, you never knew what you were going to get, from a child that came in with a high fever and it's, bilateral otitis media, okay, but it's in the middle of the night, right? It's their first child, you can be reading that and stuff, to going in and having somebody be in a motor vehicle accident, have a fracture of a rib, and they do an x-ray and the radiologist sees a mass in the lung. You're like, whoa, you didn't see that coming. And so, it was never boring. And now, like I said, it's one thing to be out there and being in the middle of it, but getting to read it, you were always educated. I mean, right? I mean, every day did you kind of say, wow, I didn't know they could do that, to do this, to take care of that, or and your knowledge base is just growing and growing and growing. It's a niche, but it's diverse.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree.
You could have a neurologist and a cardiologist and a pediatrician all reading those ER consults all at the same time. What do you think then, if somebody thinks that they want to start specializing in ED work, what would you suggest that they do? Is there anything specific that they would need additional training, or, absolutely the credential, but what would you advise them to do?
I think that the biggest thing that is helpful for most people getting into ED is going to be knowing your anatomy and physiology. I think that is a major part of coding for the emergency room, because as you were saying, you do have all of these different fractures, and if you don't know if the bone's in the leg or the arm, then you're going to have an issue trying to code it. And there's a lot of signs and symptoms, things that you have to code for that reason. And with the outpatient guidelines for ICD-10, you're not supposed to code the signs and symptoms if you have a definitive diagnosis, but what constitutes a definitive diagnosis?
Right.
Do I realize this is part of it or not? Which one of these diagnoses is worse than the other one? Knowing your anatomy and physiology will help you determine a lot of that. The other thing that's really helpful is just having some clinical knowledge, one way or the other. I'm like you. I started as an EMT and a CNA, a nurse aide. I did work in ER for a little while. Maybe that's the reason I like it too, because when I'm reading the charts, I see it occurring. So, yeah, I think the major thing is just to be very strong in your ICD-10, be very strong in your anatomy and physiology, and surgical procedures and things like that. That's what we see in the
ED. I was the fish hook queen, because we lived in a resort area, so everybody was getting fish hooks caught in their body. So I was they'd always say, okay, go set up the fish hook. And what about pharmacology? Because we have an anatomy and physiology course at CCO, and if somebody doesn't have that medical background, we always, hey, you probably,
really need that,
should sit for that. But we also have pharmacology, and I know that plays a really big role, especially in risk adjustment. So anybody that gets into risk adjustment, man, you got to draw that line, and you need to know pharmacology, and know the medicines and stuff. Do you think that that's beneficial for ER or not?
Well, it depends on which side of the ER you're on. It definitely does come into play when you see, for instance, a dopamine drip hung, or you see that they're giving them Lovenox, or you see that they're doing something, the atropine. Then in your mind, wait a minute, they don't give this to people that aren't sick. This is really high risk. They are having to, if you know your anatomy and physiology, and you do know that pharmacology, you know that when they push this drug or they hang this drug, they're having to check the vital signs every 15 minutes.
Right. And, that's a good point.
And that's on your risk table. If you'll notice, that is one of the things that gets you to the higher risk, is that it's a high maintenance drug, a drug that they're giving, that they're having to monitor this person constantly on.
I just thought of something too. If you have somebody that comes in with stroke symptoms, paralysis on one side, they're not going to give them TPA if it's a hemorrhagic stroke, right? I mean,
Right.
you've got two types of stroke, and that right there tells you that if they're getting TPA, it's not hemorrhagic because they would bleed out, right? And but you may not know that, and you may, you got to know which code to use. If it, what's causing the obstruction. So that's good advice too. What about setting for that credential, the ED credential? What would you say that would benefit somebody that's getting ready to set for that? Is there something that, and I don't know how long ago it's been since you sat for that, but any feedback or kind of pointers about that credential?
For the emergency department credential, that one, I think what I did mostly for it was to make sure that I did get the companion study guide. I did go take my, the test that they provide when you're trying to get that credential, because one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that the way E&M codes are evaluated will change from client to client. As long as they have written it down, that this is the way that they want to do it, then you have no liability towards that because they've written it down and you're just following their guidelines. So there is a little bit of difference between the way the test wants you to do some of the E&M levels as opposed to if you were working and you had practical knowledge and you were doing it. So just make sure you answer the question that they ask.
Yeah.
And don't bring anything into it. Just figure out the way that they are wanting you to do the test. I think that's the major
What do they want to know if I know or not, right?
Yeah, what do they want to know? What are they trying to find out? And how are they telling me that I need to get to this level? Because
that's good advice.
Because I mean, they may be doing it where you are and being very aggressive, or they may be, erring on the side of caution. And there is a little bit of gray area, especially when you're doing that moderate to moderate high region. So
right.
Force will get you every time in the ED.
Yeah. And you definitely, going back to being, an auditor, when you pay a company like the one that Liz has, that, you're paying them to come in and look for any improvements that you can make, or catch any errors, so that when the people that get paid to find mistakes, the government auditors come in, that if they find anything, you can already show in your compliance plan, hey, we had an audit, they come in, they identified it, and this is our plan, we've been correcting it, and that's kind of an outlier. You can see that we're getting better and stuff. One other thing about your other credential, I do know that when I went back a few years ago, and I checked back in at the hospital that I used to work at, and asked them, at the time that I was there, all of the coders, of course, were in-house, and now they were not. They would come in once a week for meetings. But one of the coders mentioned that they are requiring them to get that E&M credential now, and I was really surprised. And so that is something you may start seeing a little more in the future if you haven't already noticed that in your area. That if you are going to be coding E&M, especially for outpatient facility and stuff like that, they want you to have that credential under your belt. And especially if you're an auditor, most people think that auditors just do E&M, and it's not true. But having a credential that shows that you specialize in that's very important. Wouldn't you say so as well? Or I mean, is E&M what most people freak out about when they're going to have somebody come in and do an audit for them?
Well, actually, mine is scheduled for May 18th, so wish me luck.
Good luck. Yeah.
But yeah, I think that E&M is what we have the major confusion over, whether it be physician's office, ED, or even the inpatient or facility. And the reason is because we're trying to measure the cognitive abilities of the doctor. We're trying to measure his thinking, and there's so much room for interpretation when we're trying to measure cognitive function. And I know that there's audit tools and there's things out there that kind of help us and gear us towards that. But for the most part, we're not comparing apples to apples. We're comparing apples to oranges, because his process is clinical and what we're comparing it to is documentation, and it's completely different. Right. So I think one of the things that really needs to happen is a move towards phrasing the coding that we're doing more towards the way the clinical is looking. But that's just a personal opinion of mine.
My personal opinion
is the one that's mostly open for discussion and mostly open for interpretation.
I suspect you're going to agree with me, but the thing, I guess not my goal, what would we say? What I would do a little happy dance for is if the med schools started requiring that their future providers take a coding course, both in CPT and ICD, just to let them see how to communicate better with their coders, because they're never taught that, and then they're thrown out there into the world now making malpractice insurance payments and their student loan payments, and you know, they want to get reimbursed, and then that's when they just get fed up and say, well, what do you want me to write down so that I can get paid? It's like, no, it doesn't work like that. You know.
Well, yeah, and I think that a lot of the newer doctors that I've seen, thankfully, I've seen that there has been a trend towards them at least having that, or actually even getting their credential a lot of times.
I noticed that too, and that really pleases me. I don't know if you know, but down in Austin, so we're both in Texas, by the way, and over in Austin, the new med school, the local chapter president, she's trying to work with them to do some training for the med school for those people. And so I think that's brilliant. I would like to see that happen. We're, you know, usually we would be taking questions right now, guys, but I don't think that I'm going to be able to see your questions. And I bet you are chomping at the bit and you've got all kinds of questions that you're posting. So what I'd like to do is let you know you can go post them over on the CCO Club. We'll get Liz in there, but we'll also show her where the Facebook and the YouTube channel is so that she can answer some questions. But are you open to having them ask you questions in the future? Is that a possibility, or you?
I don't mind answering questions, and if I don't know, I will tell you.
Okay. So you know her website now, and we are wanting to get her in as a subject matter expert for CCO at the club. So you can also, if you're already a club member, feel free to put your questions in there, and we'll make sure that she has access to look, just say, you know, attention to Liz, that or even compliment her if you want to and say thank you. We'll make sure she gets that information. So just kind of wrapping up, let's backtrack. What made you decide to get into coding? And then after you tell us that, the next question is, what made you decide to get into auditing? And you know, and you already said about why you went with the ER, but what made you decide to become a coder?
Well, actually, I was working for this little place. You might have heard of them. They're called Team Health. I was in Alcoa, Tennessee, and I was the data entry. I was doing data entry back when, you know, we used to write it down on the paper and then we'd have somebody else to put it in the system. And I had noticed that, you know, that was going away. They were starting to put it more on computer. And so I asked, you know, what would be the best field to get into, you know, to continue in this type of job market. And they told me that was medical coder. So I signed up and became a medical coder. It was really just that simple. I liked being in healthcare. I liked being in the documentation part of it. You know, I really enjoyed coding. I did have friends at the place that was coding. It seemed very interesting to me. So at that point, I just grandfathered into their coding program. I took a college course. I actually did go to a campus. It was that long ago. And, you know, just went from there. Started out as a commercial payer coder and then worked my way up to Medicare. And
That's great. And then eventually, after you'd been in a while, your experience was under your belt, and then went into auditing.
And I applied for a remote position, and then I did a lot of coordination and administrative duties, and the auditing just was part of that at that point. So yeah, I've been doing a lot of different aspects of the coding world for quite a while now.
So let me ask you another question. We did have a question. It says, I do ED now, but I want to take it up a notch. Any suggestions? If they're doing ED coding right now and they want to, step it up a notch, what would you, first of all, get that credential, right? But what else would you suggest that they do? It's a question that came in.
I think that the credential is definitely good. I think that if you have at least 5 years of experience under your belt, you definitely should start looking in the auditing direction. Another thing that you could do, I know that it is sometimes hard to move up in companies, especially if you're a really good producer. Start looking for companies that are needing auditors, or people that are saying that they want you to start coding, but they have auditing openings. And it's always going to be your experience. I have noticed that a lot of times people really don't want an auditor unless they have that 5-year experience. It seems to be the magic number for the auditing.
Yeah.
So, if you've got less than that, then keep on, for a couple more years. If you don't, if you do have your 5 years, maybe go ahead and start thinking about that CPMA or at least that CEDC.
Good point. And I was going to ask you another thing, and I saw that come off on the corner of my eye. I don't want to. Oh, I know. Now, again, you're in a different realm because you're doing auditing and everything. We get this asked so often at CCO is, what can one expect to be a salary range in, for coders and everything? Are you familiar with, and again, it's regional, all that plays a part, but what would be an average salary range for an ED coder? Do you maybe know? Not an auditor, but an ED coder.
Well, if an ED coder just starting out, 1 or 2 years experience is probably going to make $21 to $22 an hour. That's probably going to be about an average standard. I mean, of course, there's always room for a little bit more, a little bit less, depending on where you are.
Where you live. Like Houston pays really good, by the way, but other places may not.
Experience plays a big part. Experience plays a part on getting above that 22 number.
One of the things about being an ER coder is that you're probably employed by the facility, right? And not always, because we got urgent cares and stuff like that popping up all over the place. But if you work for a facility, you get a raise every year usually. As I remember one of the coders that we worked with, she had started at like 18 and had never stopped working there, and she was in her mid 30s, and she was making really good money because every year she got a little bitty raise, little bitty raise, and she just so that's something to consider too. Remote jobs tend to pay a little bit more, right? But they aren't. It also depends if you're a contract worker versus an employee, and also jobs come in spurts. If you work for a place that contracts out, maybe they get pulls. I know that works with risk adjustment, but that kind of works in all areas. There might be lulls when you work remote and things, but always keep in mind that if you are working remote, that a lot of those jobs that pay a little bit more, you are contracted. That means you have to pay your own taxes and such. So always consider that. And of course, now if you're working for a group and they're looking to get some auditing done, again, this is a good place to go and look. And those are pretty standard prices for specialties being audited, across the board, not just ER work. Can you give just wrap up, last thing we'll talk about is that if somebody is working, because we've got a wide scope of people that come to CCO, let's say they're looking for an auditor, what should they specifically look for in picking an external auditor to come in?
I think one of the major things to look for is, like we've discussed before, is experience. I mean, there is a great deal of people out there that are doing audits. And I know a lot of the audits that you get from the government and things like that, you need to look and see who the auditor is, because they are not always credentialed. I think that
Right.
you're looking for an auditor, you need to look for the experience that they have. You need to look for the credentials that they have. And if you are in a specialty like a cardiologist or a spine surgeon, those are very particular specialties in the coding world. I mean, you don't want an ED coder trying to do your spine guidelines. So, I mean, it really is. You need to look for experience, you need to look for credentials, and you need to look for your specialty.
That's great. I appreciate it. Okay, well, thank you so much, Liz, for being with us. I'm going to go back to the slide deck. And, you know, we normally can kind of tap into more questions, and I apologize about that. Next week we'll probably be set up. We're going to try to do more interviews, you know, and have people like Liz come in and give feedback from time to time as a subject matter expert, to kind of, you know, it's one thing to hear us talk about stuff all the time, but to bring somebody in that has that experience. And you know, I think that's beneficial. And then you've made a network connection, because you can reach out to Liz, and if that's something you think you might be interested in. So I appreciate you being with us. Thank you, Liz. This has been a lot of fun. I really enjoyed meeting you in New Braunfels, and I hope we get to work together in the future too. So.
Oh, absolutely. All right. Thanks for having me. Bye.
Bye-bye, guys.